Hey, Ms. Bahak here. Welcome to an episode of the Habit Chess podcast. On this show, if this is our first time crossing paths, what I like to do sometimes is share books that I've been reading with you, share my notes, my highlights, my annotations, and many times I do this weeks or months after I've read the book. And so I've gone through these notes probably 5 times or more at this point. And also I've had more time to marinate and incubate on a lot of these ideas, because I find that a lot of product reviews or book summaries even happen right as soon as they've been read, which it is fresh, it's exciting. But what about the application of it sometimes as you're going throughout your day, as you're encountering people in your life, you're starting to see some of the things that, are play out, or you're learning and applying them. So I like to do that. I feel like it produces more useful episodes sometimes when I have the chance to do it. And today's book is the perfect one that I want to share with you. It's called The First Rule of Mastery by Michael Gervais. And there's many reasons why I dove into this book. I think the word mastery brought me in. Obviously, I enjoy reading stories about people who have mastered skills. The show, we cover skill stacking, skill acquisition, the art of learning. Robert Greene's book, Mastery, is a book I come back to often. It's something I read 12 years ago and read it on Audible because it was too dense for me to comprehend in print and stuff. But Finding Mastery was a podcast that I listened to, which was actually hosted by this author, Michael Gervais. And he is a sports psychologist for professional sports teams, players, and all sorts of high performers at this point. And I really appreciated his outlook on mastery and performance, and how he was able to, with this book at least, go beyond just sports psychology and focus on the concept of mastery itself. And when you hear the subtitle alone, it makes you think. It's called The First Rule of Mastery. Stop worrying about what others think of you, or something like that. And one of the things that it brought up for me, and this wasn't immediate, by the way, but this is as time has gone on and I've paid attention to it. It is funny how as you are getting better at something, as you're doing something that's different, where you're not blending in to what everybody else around you might be doing, you stand out. And that attention, sometimes people love it. I'm somebody who has a weird relationship with it, where I like to blend in sometimes. I do like the feeling of standing out. I'm sure like most humans do to some extent. But in many cases, I enjoy blending in. But this is disastrous sometimes if you are chasing mastery in something, because by definition, you have to let go of what others think, because they're going to be thinking all sorts of things. People look at master chefs, musicians, basketball players, you name a profession, a field, and often those people are slightly strange. There's something off about them that allows them to, part of what you admire, if you meet somebody who is a master tuba player, part of what you admire about that tuba player, the awe and appreciation that you have when you're in a stadium and they're playing the tuba to the stadium, is, wow, this person had to endure so much of tuning out what other people think to continue to play, to continue to protect this thing that they're doing, in order to get to a place where they were masterful at it. Because there's unlimited choices of other things you could do, and other people's opinions do sway that a bit. And I think that's a great segue into the first opener for today's book, which I thought this was a great line, by the way. It's the first sentence of the introduction. When we give more value to other people's opinions than our own, we live life on their terms, not ours. I remember first opening that book, and I didn't need to read much more for a little bit, because I just thought about that line, how you give power to other people when they're trying to get on your nerves and things like that. But when you hear it this way, when we give more value to other people's opinions than our own, we live life on their terms, not ours. And I think what it made me think was oh, the part here that stands out is not just other people's opinions, but their opinions over our own. It makes you think for a second, what is my opinion of myself? And doesn't that matter? I think that was a powerful question that it prompted for me. The next quote I want to share with you is, one tree can make 1,000 matches, and one match can burn 1,000 trees. Now, I'll give you the paragraphs just so you can get context of it a little bit. Now, I had more positive opinions than negative. However, I found the negative opinions to be way more magnetic. They held more weight at the time. Being stuck on those negative words, as I see it now, reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. One tree can make 1,000 matches, and one match can burn 1,000 trees. This is a really deep quote where it like broke my brain again for a second, where I just think about it for a while. But it's so true. The next quote, when we experience FOPO, we lose faith in ourselves and our performance suffers. So FOPO is the abbreviation for fear of other people's opinions. This was one of the greatest acronyms that kind of stuck with me, I think, afterward, because just like FOMO, fear of missing out, fear of other people's opinions, made this a concept that felt like, oh, okay, this is more normal and common than just maybe me. And I think that sometimes when you're reading a book to improve certain things, and especially if you're affected by it, you seeing stories, experiencing it through other people's lenses can do a lot in terms of just making you go, okay, all right. Even just knowing that other people experience this too does make it a little bit better. You feel a little less bad sometimes before you even get to any of the solutions to FOPO. So anyways, I think that was another big area here, is like losing faith in ourselves, coming back to, again, our opinions of ourselves, our faith in ourselves. A lot of times you don't think about that, right? Because every day you're just bombarded with sometimes what others are thinking and what others are serving you. So anyways, the next one that I wanted to dive into is, the sooner you fundamentally change your relationship with other people's opinions, the sooner you become free. Totally free to be at home with yourself wherever you are. This is more rare than you think. I feel like this was way easier for me when I was younger for some reason. I'm not sure why. I'm sure maybe you resonate with that, but it becomes something you actively realize. People being totally free of what someone else thinks is not as common as you might imagine. Growing up, I thought it was just me, just our family, just Indian people, Asian people, like we all care a lot of what other people think, and you experience that a lot. But no, as you get older, you meet more people, you talk to more people, you realize, oh, okay, no, this is a universal thing. Everybody does care to some extent what they think, right? Especially with the inventions of social media. And now everybody's got a profile. You got to optimize your bio. You got to optimize, your grid, what it looks like. And so, I feel like we're more prone to caring about what other people think. And so in today's day and age, especially when you find and meet people who are totally free of other people's opinions and fine with who they are, you notice it, you feel it without any words having to be said. Okay, so this is a long highlight that I made. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but I will give you a small paragraph. So we externalize our self-esteem, our sense of value. We see ourselves through the eyes of others. We look outside of ourselves to determine how we feel about ourselves. If people approve of us or the choices we make, we feel great. If others disapprove of us or the choices we make, we feel terrible. We scamper around the world trying to please others and being who we think people want us to be, rather than who we are. We are unaware of our own needs, or we dismiss our needs as we hustle for our self-worth. Okay, so there's more there, but again, another theme in this book, turning it inwards, turning it back to you. Like, what do you need to approve of yourself? That can go a long way. That can really narrow down some of the things that you want to focus on sometimes. Externalizing our self-esteem, I think that line is crazy. Our sense of value. We see ourselves through the eyes of others. And I know, and I've seen this firsthand, when people experience this for like decades and decades, it's possible, I'm sure, but it's hard to undo. It's like you can see it. It's very difficult for people to get out of that vibe of just constantly viewing life through how others are perceiving and seeing them. And it's not fun. Sometimes, like, I think when people are just totally aloof, that's not great either when you're unaware. But it almost seems more blissful. That's what they say, ignorance is bliss, is you're not affected by this fear of other people's opinions sometimes. So I feel like those people get very lucky in that way. So in fact, success, especially when achieved in the public eye, makes us more susceptible to FOPO. Imagine being subjected to a 24/7 feedback loop of criticism and praise from fans, media, and social media users. If you're a pop star or an actress, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that I found interesting, which is the more successful you become, you actually are worrying sometimes more about what other people think, because now you might have people who are envious of you. You might be experiencing imposter syndrome. You might be, again, those comments stick through and out if they're negative sometimes. And some people have a higher threshold for what they can tolerate than others. But I find that similar to something that Dane Cook said, which is like, when you become famous, you open up the doors to all of the people in the world that hate you. So yes, you are getting people who like you, but for the first time ever, you're getting a totally 50-50 split sometimes of people saying the worst things about you. And that's a new, like, mental skill, I think, that our generation, future generations, have to grow up with, is being able to be somewhat immune to it, being able to cope with it and deal with it and use it as fuel, not let it get to you. I do like how over the years, trolls and people who are just totally negative sometimes, where you're like, I can't believe somebody actually said this and published it, let alone published it. There's just this like theme where you know, okay, that's a troll. And we all know, like, they're the ones that are angry, like what's really going on sometimes behind people making those kinds of comments versus, I think that takes weight away from it versus, if not, it would be this thing where it's like these unknown people can cause chaos just by saying something mean. And what's crazy is human brains do work that way, no matter who you are. Like you'll be affected by something or some amount of it at some point. So that's just something to think about, is okay, cool. You almost feel grateful. Okay, I'm not experiencing it to that degree. I'm not getting loads of hate mail or death threats or all of those different things. But anyways, let's move on. That's why it's important to begin the process and mental work of changing our focus to what we can control ourselves. Mastery in any area of life, the arts, business, parenting, sports, requires being able to differentiate what is and is not within our control. This one, we've heard this so many times, but for some reason, hearing it this way, maybe it's next to the words mastery, but it's a good reminder. It did make me, I remember as I was reading it, begin to segment out some of the things that I can control and like focusing more on the inputs. I remember that was a time where my mind shifted heavily into the inputs over the outputs, because a lot of times the outputs are all you hear about. This is ideal, this is optimal, but to even get that requires usually focusing on a input or a series of inputs repeatedly. So anyways, knowing what you can control is that those are the inputs. Next one is, hence the first rule of mastery requires looking within and fundamentally committing to work on mastering what's 100% under your control. There is nothing else that can be mastered. This is the essence of the path. This one I like. Developing an awareness of our fears about the opinions of others is the first step to discharging the power they hold over us. This one's easy. A lot of times you'll go, I don't care what people think. I'm that way too. And I was that way when I picked this up as well, where, okay, yeah, a part of me, 20, 30, 40% of the time, sometimes it feels like 100. Oh, I don't care what people think. But it's good to be in the mode sometimes where you're like, wait a second. That's not always the case. I am affected by it, just like other humans are. Let's dive into how that's affecting mastery and my ability to get there, my ability to make moves. And so I think even opening up your mind to the fact that we have FOPO, you're experiencing it, you have experienced it, it is a big thing. It's a big step. Next up is this quote that is in the opening of chapter 1, Beethoven's Secret. An artist must never be a prisoner of himself, prisoner of a style, prisoner of a reputation, prisoner of success. That is by Henry Matisse. Okay, so mastery is an inner directed life, externally expressed. And then jumping a paragraph here, if your orientation is to take the temperature of the world around you before tapping into the fire inside you, you will never unlock your potential. This one I didn't highlight, but I'm glad that I screenshot these and I can see the following text around it sometimes, is mastery is not comparative. So the foundational measuring stick for mastery is what each of us individually is capable of becoming. And we don't know what that looks like until we embrace the first rule of mastery. Oh, this was an exercise. I actually did this exercise. I think it's good to highlight this. Draw a big circle and a smaller inner circle inside, so it almost looks like a donut. In the outer circle, list all the things that matter in life, but that you don't have 100% control over. Start with other people's opinions, since it's pretty clear we don't have control over those. Add things like weather, the sports teams you care about, bosses, market conditions, workplace environment. It's a long list. In the smaller circle, list those things that are 100% under your control. Things like the time you arrive at work, how you communicate with your children, your effort on the playing field. And basically, you get the idea. This one was actually a worthwhile exercise. I'm actually going to revisit it, but it's basically like showing an image or a diagram of this donut. And in the middle of the circle is 100% in your control, your thoughts, your words, your actions, and your attitudes. And everything around it is cool, not 100% in your control. The past, traffic, weather, cats, other people's happiness, how other people feel, smoke detectors that go off at night, the future, 3-year-olds, and like all these other things that sometimes I think it's good to just label. It goes a long way to label. Anyways, that if you take one thing away, that exercise is actually probably a good one to do. You contort to fit in. You sacrifice authentic expression on the altar of approval. You twist yourself into a shape that appears socially acceptable but is performative in nature. The response does not represent your authentic self. Contorting creates a temporary relief, but leaves you feeling disconnected from others. Because you don't share your true self, you never feel connected, understood, or embraced, nor do you become a trusted member of the community. By pretending to be someone you're not, you constantly feel the pressure to maintain the facade. This can intensify the feelings of insecurity and fear of exposure. I think this concept of contortion that it talks about is really cool. It's so true. And I think it also relates to if you're simply talking about content creation and production in general. Because I recently got to work with a client where we got to experience him not being himself, sounding like himself, like totally engineering what he sounds like and who he is almost. And I just had to say something like, look, people are going to pick up on that. People pick up on that in video. In modern day, the intelligence to pick up on BS is pretty impressive compared to if you think about, I don't know, just the 1900s or 1950s, even the late 1990s before technology. I don't know if that's just me, but I feel like there's a difference. Anyways, just knowing the cost of contortion, it's something to keep in mind. The last and healthiest response to potential rejection is to turn inward and respond based on our own internal standards. The goal each and every time you hear the chimes of FOPO is to focus more on who you want to be versus who you think they want you to be. This one is a powerful one. This one is worth writing down, pausing, and really coming back to, because when I read this, I was like, okay, that's a great exercise to train your brain to do. That's a little micro skill because you're not used to thinking like that. When you typically hear, oh man, this is what somebody else thinks of me, your brain can be a little hijacked. And so if you focus more on who you want to be versus who you think they want you to be, this again forces you to think about, do I have any internal standards? I'm sure I do, but where are they? What do they sound like? Have I ever written them down? That's what it made me think about, and it made me revisit, if you have them already, you revisit it, you sharpen it a little bit. Is this accurate? And that is actually another great takeaway. If you don't do that other exercise from before, take this one away. The goal each and every time you hear the chimes of FOPO is to focus more on who you want to be versus who you think they want you to be. A poor sense of self is the most common on-ramp to FOPO. When we lack a clear, stable, and positive understanding of who we are, we often look outside ourselves to see how we feel about ourselves. We assume others can see us better than we can see ourselves, and as a result, we give power and credibility to other people's opinions. We rely on the other person to provide signals of approval or potential rejection. This is important because, again, it's signaling inward. Where are your standards? Where are your values? Where are your priorities? Because if you don't have them, again, fill in the blank. People will tell you exactly what it is. They'll tell you what to value. Marketing and advertising will tell you what to think. And I talked to a guest on Habit Chess, Ethan Schindler. He was talking about self-leadership and how if you wake up and you're not looking at your values or revisiting them every day, like, you're getting sucked into somebody else's plan, everything that you do throughout the day. So having this guiding light was one of the first things that it made me begin to think of. I was like, oh man, I should come up with it, or I should sharpen whatever I have if I already do. And that's an exercise that's worth doing, is like beginning to do that. And we'll get there. It hints at a more formal one, but for anybody who just bounces at this point, come up with your list of the top 5, top 10, top 15, whatever values you can think of that feel like, yep, that's important to me. And what's cool about this is it doesn't just have to be like traditional things that you think sound good. The point of this exercise is to truly find what sounds good to you, not just what sounds good to other people. Okay, the next one. A performance-based identity is also a fast track to FOPO. A performance-based identity, which we discussed in Chapter 4, is when one's identity is defined by our performance. We define ourselves by how well we perform in relationship to others. We condition ourselves to look outward for self-definition, and in the process learn to value external feedback more highly than our own internal feedback. I think this one is really cool because a lot of people experience performance-based identity. What's actually awesome about it, if there is anything awesome, is that you achieve pretty amazing levels of achievement in many cases. But what sucks is like your satisfaction, your fulfillment, your happiness suffers a little bit because it's volatile. It's constantly dependent on how you perform last. Very common if you played sports, you're an athlete, performer, something like that. But just worth knowing that, okay, that is a potential trigger for FOPO. If you have that, you may be susceptible to fear of other people's opinions, and it's something to keep in mind. In fact, one person I've worked with was one of the best pitchers in baseball, a Cy Young Award winner who, unbeknownst to most people, had a crippling anxiety about being criticized and judged by others. We went through a process called systematic desensitization, a treatment that helps people deal with phobias by progressively exposing them to fear-inducing stimuli. The first step of the process was to understand how he experiences fear. I needed to get a better sense of what it was like to be him. How did he identify with success and failure? How central was baseball to his identity? Did he experience increases in breathing and heart rate? Did he have the feeling of being unsettled? Did he have difficulty digesting food? Did he experience difficulty sleeping? Did his body feel tight? And it basically keeps going on and on. And the reason I highlighted it was because that story was really interesting. One, but two, the concept of systematic desensitization. The mechanics of systematic desensitization entails pairing the least frightening stimulus with the relaxation technique multiple times until the fear response diminishes. The process is based on a principle called reciprocal inhibition that posits that you cannot be anxious and relaxed at the same time. The maladaptive response gets replaced with an adaptive response. Conditioned effects of anxiety are inhibited by purposefully inducing a state of relaxation. So this is pretty cool because this is that idea of naturally your brain takes over and it's like you're breathing super heavy and it's like hard to get back in control. And if you can catch it, that's usually the first step. Oh, this is a moment. This is where FOPO is happening, number one. But two, then being able to desensitize yourself to it. Breathing is probably the first step because your brain is automatically linking this event or this opinion or this thing to danger, breathing heavy, heart rate goes up, sweating, anger, whatever. So if you can catch it, one, and then two, be able to breathe in a way where you feel, it doesn't even have to be like, oh, you went from 150 BPM down to 60 BPMs. It's literally, even if you bring it down a tiny bit. The next part is the goal is to become gradually desensitized to the triggers causing the distress. Because if you can do it in dosable amounts, right, you can do it in a way where your system's not just completely being zonked, right, but you're getting that exposure, you're breathing to it, through it, and being able to go, oh, that was fine, I'm still alive. It's extremely powerful for your brain when you go through that kind of an event and you come out on the other end. Yeah, basically goes into kind of more technicalities of this, but like this type of exposure therapy helps individuals overcome their fears, develop coping mechanisms, and regain a sense of control and confidence in the face of anxiety-provoking situations. Oh, I love this one. So perfectionism is not driven by a healthy striving for excellence as much as it is an effort to avoid the negative judgment of others and the shame of not measuring up to our identity. We long for the acceptance and belonging, but believe those needs can be met only if our performance meets or exceeds expectations. This is, you'll resonate with it if you have a performance-based identity or you have at any point in the past. I think it's an interesting way to flip it because a lot of times the people that you know in your life that might be perfectionists, you feel like, oh, wow, what a great flaw to have. Like you're perfect or you appear that way, but it's often interesting what's going on in between the years for those people. And I've been around some very high-performing people who are affected by perfectionism. And it's actually interesting. I did think about some of those people as soon as I read this line. It goes to this next part. People who develop a performance-based identity do tend to perform well by objective measures, but the identity is buttressed by external validation. The praise and opinions of others fuel the identity. Performance-based model can work, but it's not sustainable. And so this is where you see this time and time again with people who have achieved insane levels of success in a given craft. And then they've become so successful that they can quit or they can stop because they can burn out. So that's another case where it's like, it does fuel you. It does work. It does get to greatness a lot of times. But what does it cost along the way? And is that worth it? To some people it is, and to some they'd like to figure out a way around that. So something to think about, but I like this one here. So performance-based identity is not to be confused with self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a belief in one's ability to perform a certain task. Performance-based identity is a belief about who you are based on the result of the tasks performed. Part of the allure of a performance-based identity, unlike other work identities, is that it's transferable. It can be carried across companies and even across jobs, something that holds appeal in an era when we change careers and roles more frequently. This next one, you can probably relate to this. Identity foreclosure, a process where people prematurely commit to an identity before they have had a chance to explore and contemplate all the options. I think everybody can relate to this because modern schooling encourages this. It's, hey, pick something. You have barely any idea what it's about, what it will look like, but pick it and you're going to hopefully stick with it for the next 20 years or whatever. I never heard that term, but it was interesting to see that. Progress that mistakenly think they're finished. At each point in our life's journey, we tend to imagine who we are at a point in time is the person we'll be for the remainder of our lives. A misconception Gilbert calls the end of history illusion. Yeah, I think that's relatable, don't you? That's always the case. You feel like, oh, when I'm this person, when I feel like this person, I've done this thing, I'll be complete. And that often moves so fast that you don't even notice that it's happening, where you very quickly, as soon as you achieve the thing, before you've even fully achieved it, boom, there's the next one that's ready to take its place. This is a belief, way to think about it that I thought was useful. The belief that this is who I am right now and I'm a work in progress is qualitatively different than this is who I am. The latter gives rise to a rigid, fixed identity that is more susceptible to FOPO. And we know how important it is what you tell your brain and how you talk to it. And so that simple shift in words can go a long way in just reminding you, oh, this is not who I am. This is who I am right now, and I'm a work in progress. I think a lot of things could be avoided if, when those thoughts come up, they can be sorted out. It's just easier said than done. Purpose, rather than approval, becomes the filter through which we make decisions, establish priorities, and make choices. We check in to see whether our thoughts and words measure up to our purpose. Purpose, as described by Ben Holtberg, is a powerful motivator that organizes our sense of identity around what we value most. For people with a purpose-based identity, it's not the evaluation of other people that drives them or fuels them. It's the meaning of what they're doing and the potential of what they can impact. Those two are very different fuels. One is sustainable and the other will burn you out. So this one I thought was really cool. After this, I spent a couple weeks actually. It took me probably a couple weeks to refine it and get to a place where I was happy with it. But I came up with 25 different priorities, values, whatever you want to call them, that felt like, okay, this is worth investing time into. So often keep in mind, with the identity that you might have if you're listening to this episode, it might be tough for you to slow down and really marinate on, what is my purpose? What things do I value? And thinking about that is one thing, and then making it a list is another thing. But if you can go that far, I promise you, it is probably one of the most useful documents that you will ever write, wherever you place it. The goal is to keep it accessible. So what if you need to keep it in your notes and you can keep it pinned, for example, that works very well. But I really look at it. Actually, another thing that inspired it, not just this book, was I've seen some people have their company values. Nike has a really famous one that it had out there, like their 10 commandments or whatever. So coming up with your own, I think, is a very useful thing to do, that you believe in, that when you see it, it excites you, it energizes you, you feel something when you hear it or see it. I think whatever those are for you, because they're different for everybody, it's one of the most valuable exercises that you can probably do from this. Okay, next, the idea is that the self-worth is a judgment about the self, so it must be based on some criteria. Wolf established 7 different domains where students were most likely to stake their self-worth. 5 of the areas were external: appearance, academic competence, competition, approval from others, and family support. 2 areas were internal: God's love and virtue. Our judgment about our own self-worth is contingent upon the outcomes in those areas. Success means I not only close the deal, but I am worthy and valuable. We only make judgments about ourselves in those areas where we have planted our self-worth. SDT holds that human beings are driven by 3 basic internal needs that must be fulfilled to perform optimally and to experience well-being. They need to feel capable and effective in meeting the demands of the environment, which is competence. They need to feel a sense of belonging and a sense that they matter to others and others matter to them, which is relatedness. Lastly, they need autonomy, the freedom to make choices that align with their priorities, beliefs, and values. Autonomy in this context does not mean independence. It means having volition and control. So I thought those 3 were worth looking at and noting down and thinking about, that is interesting. And SDT, by the way, I didn't explain what that acronym is, but self-determination theory, which is psychologist Richard Ryan and Ed Dietschy's widely accepted self-determination theory, SDT. Next is, when your self-worth is contingent upon success or failure in a particular area, your primary drive often becomes proving to yourself and others that you meet these conditions of worth. Rather than actively working toward achieving our goals, we become fixated on avoiding unfavorable outcomes. Perhaps above all, contingent self-worth empowers people's opinions about us at the expense of our own and undercuts the basic human need for autonomy. Yes, this is how it tied back to the previous thing, which is in a roundabout way, it does infringe upon that autonomy needlessly. So there's other situations where it's already hard to have maybe independence or autonomy, but it's with at least this part, with other people and what they think of you, it feels like this thing that could be avoided. We could do without it. We could eliminate it. We crowdsource our sense of self. We allow other people to decide how we feel about ourselves. The degree to which we empower the opinions of others varies depending on the environment, situation, and the domain of worth in which our identity is anchored. I think this is important because it's not just bad opinions. I think this goes equally for good opinions. So when you let great opinions of other people affect how you actually feel, that great comment holds just as much weight as a negative comment will. And so a way I found a lot of times to not have the negative comment affect you as much is to not give so much weight to the positive one, which then makes you go, well, then what do I think? And then it does force you again one inward, where you're like, oh, I have to have some other standards outside of those two outcomes. And usually it's an opportunity for depth. You have to think deeply about what those are, and that's not always a bad thing. Next up, we crowdsource our sense of self. Okay, no, I just read that. This is a famous quote in this chapter, Chapter 7, Barry Manilow and the Spotlight Effect. You will become way less concerned with what other people think of you when you realize how seldom they do. It's a quote by David Foster Wallace. I think that this chapter is actually one of the best because it highlights on this thing that we can feel sometimes. Oh, everybody's looking at me, everybody's thinking about me. What are they? And it goes on to showcase certain studies and certain things that are like, oh, shoot, wow, okay, so other people feel that exact thing too. It's not just me, I'm not crazy. The advantage of developing mental skills is that your internal experience is not dictated by your external environment. I love this because you can have a very rich life if your mental landscape is pretty good and if you've designed it in a way that you feel pretty good. Because I don't think it just happens automatically. Like, it's chaotic by design and you do have to organize it a bit. But this is part of why I love skill stacking and learning skills, is there's so many mental skills to be developed and they have such a great impact on, how you perceive things and how you perceive and go about day-to-day life, which I think is interesting because there was a point here, it was too long of a text. I didn't, read that one, but basically it was pointing out how most things are a problem of perception at a certain point. Once you've achieved, enough money, housing, like some of the basics, a lot of things become about perception. And so if you can improve your ability to perceive and some of the mental skills surrounding that, I think it goes a long way. Next up is the practice is to calm the mind while the body is in an elevated state of agitation. If you do this over time, you get comfortable at higher levels of stress activation. This one reminds me and is very similar to the concept it was referencing earlier around desensitizing yourself gradually. Part of it is this: when you're breathing, like your heart rate's up really high, you feel very nervous, being able to breathe through that and bring it down is over time allowing you to face that same situation, that same whatever, without that same reaction. It's interesting to see how it's showing the other side of it, which I didn't think about right away, about how you can handle higher levels of that stress activation. Public speaking is a great example. So the first time you do public speaking, your throat might dry up, you need 2 bottles of water, you forgot what you're going to say, you're so nervous, you can't get a word out. But if you stood in front of that same crowd or a different crowd 10 times in a row, that same stress does not activate those same fear responses. Now, your throat might not be closing up, but you might be able to get out what you were saying. It might not be perfect, but that's level 2. This painted an image of gradual adaptation that I found pretty helpful. And I like this line: the body is only an extension of what someone is capable of doing mentally. The one, our thoughts and feelings, our actions and reactions respond not to the world as it actually is, for we never know reality directly, but to the world as we believe it to be. And this is a quote from York University psychology professor James Alcock. I thought that this is coming back again to that perception concept from earlier, where in many cases, right, it's like it doesn't matter. In today's day and age, it feels this way, right? In a digital era, like in a lot of situations, it doesn't even matter what the truth is, what the real truth is. It stops and ends at perception. So if you don't believe something is true, no matter how much evidence is in front of you, it's like, that's your, that's where it ends. That is scary, but at the same time, it should also be empowering in certain ways, because you're like, wow, you can really like operate on a different plane, different level of thinking, both in bad ways and both in good ways. And it is purely coming back to perception. So that quote made me think, our thoughts and feelings, our actions and reactions respond not to the world as it actually is, for we never know reality directly, but to the world as we believe it to be, which is interesting. It's like the same. If you've been in a really bad mood at work and you've been in a great mood at work, same environment, same whatever, but one day you might be looking out the window, wow, super grateful. But you're having a bad day, wow, it feels like the end of the world there. And that's constantly shifting and evolving for humans, which it made me think about. Confirmation bias comes from when you have an interpretation and you adopt it, and then top down you force everything to fit that interpretation. Kahneman says, that's a process that we know occurs in perception that resolves ambiguity, and it's highly plausible that a similar process occurs in thinking. There's a lot in here that I didn't highlight in that chapter because it would have been too much, but really that whole spotlight effect being this concept of us feeling that other people's eyes are just always on us, when they've done tests and studies and they ask people like, hey, can you recall who was that person that walked in with this shirt? And most people can't. And you can try this yourself. You don't need a study to tell you this. Think about somebody you saw on the road a few days ago, or even yesterday. Somebody at a stoplight that may have annoyed you or whatever. It's very hard to even recall sometimes. What were they driving? What did they look like? That stuff doesn't stick. And it's interesting to view things through that. It definitely lessens fear of other people's opinions, because you're like, oh, people aren't thinking of me as much as I think they are. They're thinking of themselves. Okay, chapter 10. This is the opening quote. I love some of the opening quotes that are underneath each chapter opening. They've been pretty good. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main, by John Donne. That really made me think about how you really do need other people. We're not individuals who have learned to be social. We are social animals who have learned to identify as separate selves. In its simplest form, the antidote to FOPO has two dimensions. One is to have deep love and care for others' well-being, and to be a contributor to the social fabric our biology is optimized for. And two, to act in alignment with one's purpose, values, and goals. This in return promotes thoughts and actions that create a rising tide for both others and self. When we act in alignment with loving others and at the same time working toward one's purpose, there is very little space for the mental energy consumed by worrying about what others may or may not be thinking of you. This is spot on, because you may have experienced these moments of flow where you're like, wow, like I'm in a zone today. Like I'm flowing from thing to thing. You're knocking things out. Like you haven't had even a chance to consider how something went or what someone's thinking. Those days, those moments are worth paying attention to what got you into that state, because it's valuable when you're really operating without a lot of that. And I think what's important is to note the number 2 part here, to act in alignment with one's purpose, values, and goals. A lot of bitterness and a lot of anger, a lot of people being unpleasant that don't need to be, stems, I think, from not being in alignment with your purpose, values, and goals. And what's cool about this is nobody's asking you to adopt theirs, okay? Nobody's being like, you have to follow this exactly. This is what it has to be. You get to make up this part. You're in full control. And often this is why a day, a couple hours, a couple weeks of consistently thinking about this type of stuff adds up to be pretty valuable, right? It's because it has a pretty deep impact on how you perceive your day-to-day and go about it. And so I thought that was interesting. Is like, yes, it's the antidote to FOPO. But it also, I think, is the antidote to misery a lot of times. Like when you find yourself in a bitter, stalled state, it's worth considering. Am I acting in alignment? Have I forgotten what my purpose, values, and goals are? Let me revisit it. Okay. The brain's primary responsibility is to take care of the body, to protect the body. The psychological self is the brain's extension of that. When our self feels attacked, our brain is going to bring to bear the same defenses that it has for protecting the body. This is, again, explains the whole, like, if you're public speaking or something, oh, wow, you're really nervous, you're starting to breathe heavy. This physiological response, I was amazed at how this is more commonly understood just in general, I feel, after all these years than it was a long time ago. And that's cool, because if we know about it, we know that, okay, cool, we might be able to desensitize ourselves to it. Okay, there's a process for it. And I know that it's not all there is to it, but to hear a lot of the stories and see how most of it centered back to breathing and being able to expose yourself to the stimuli in an environment where you felt safe or around somebody that was safe was the core of it. You don't need millions of dollars to get access to some crazy therapy that's going to do this for you. It's accessible in many cases. So I thought that this exercise at the end of this chapter was actually very useful, which is, I've seen it come up in other places too, the concept of writing down your self-limiting beliefs. So taking the time to actually go, in a non-judgmental way, by the way, what do I believe is true? And you begin to think of all of these biases. Let's say you're like, I feel like rich people suck, rich people are miserable. Okay, let's say you're also trying to become rich, but that's a belief you hold on to. That in some way, if it's running in your subconscious, is going to be probably affecting you. You're like, I don't want to be miserable. And so every time you get close to being rich or you get opportunities for that, you are maybe self-sabotaging yourself. I find that self-limiting beliefs are one of the most interesting things to uncover about ourselves because, again, the whole labeling, it's like just by calling out what it is, you don't just say it to anybody, it's just really a process with yourself. You often overcome whatever those limits are in the long run by doing this. And I'll read this section here. Take a few moments and write down a handful of beliefs that you hold to be true. Then write down a few beliefs that you're less sure about. Now, look at the point in your life when you adopted each belief and why. How did the belief serve you at that time in your life? Now explore whether that belief is currently serving you. Is it helping you be the person you want to be? Is it helping you reach your goals and vision for the life you want to lead? Or is the belief limiting what's possible for you? It's a great way to think about this. Another exercise, I know there were a couple I mentioned through here, but this one is another great one to add on at some point. Next up, the lion does not turn around when a small dog barks. It's an African proverb. It says, the greatest regret of people at the end of their lives was living for the approval of others. When the party is almost over and everyone and their opinions has gone home, you'll question why you gave them so much power in your life. This actually is like there's more paragraphs to this, obviously, but somebody basically got to talk to all these people and cataloged the greatest regret that people had at the end of their lives. And I always pay attention to that when I hear that in different places or people who have had the opportunity to be around them. Doctors are like that too. They're around a lot of people near the end of their lives, and it's pretty fascinating to hear that, right? Again, we've heard it maybe for years, we maybe know it on some level, but to see it, like, again, reminded of it, that it's not just us. The greatest regret of people at the end of their lives was living for the approval of others. And I'm sure there's a variety of ways in which this manifests for people, but you hear this just all the time nowadays. When you're 80, when you're 60, are you going to be caring about this? Are you going to be thinking about this? Will you have wish that this is something you did? And oddly, I think this is actually a filter that I use for myself, even though this is a cliche thing where it's like, oh, you'll regret at the end of your life, like, what other people thought of you or not doing this thing or that thing. I'm sure people have all kinds of regrets at the end of their life, and we all will, or hopefully we won't, but at least if we could eliminate the regrets that are tied to the approval of other people, that feels like it's a worthy goal, because that's like the worst kind of regret in any ways, because it feels so wasteful. You're like, oh, why didn't I go do this thing or whatever? Because I can feel how weighty this would be for somebody if they spent decades and decades of their life controlled by the approval of others. And so it's almost like envisioning that for myself helps me, right? Where you're like, it is cliche, yeah, but at the same time, it's a good filter. It's, will I regret this when I'm older? It's, will this really matter? And in a lot of cases, it sets into perspective. It takes you out of this hour, this day, this week, and maybe more likely to take some risks that are worth taking for you. And that is all my notes and annotations for this, for the most part. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope some of it was useful. Make sure to check out free tools and templates and resources, all that good stuff in the description below. Shoot me a text message. There should be a link in the description to do that. And if you want to reach out, make sure to email me. So that's all we got. That was most of my annotations and notes from this one. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it sparked some interesting thoughts for you, maybe a couple exercises that you can take with you. And if you want to check out the book, check out the links in the description below. There's also more free and paid tools that might be useful for you. So check the links out in the description below. Make sure to reach out. I would love to hear from you, hear your thoughts on the episode, or just if you want to say hi, you can send me a text by clicking the link in the description below, or you can shoot me an email to hi@habitchess.com. Again, I appreciate you hanging out, and if you have a second, it would be awesome if you could take some time to review the show on Spotify or Apple. It goes a really long way if you can do it. But thanks again, all the time you spent so far. It's been great hanging out, and I will see you on the next one.